in terms of testimony and evidence and what constitutes the nature of revelation. In this presentation, I'm firmly within religion and trying to answer the question of how you understand revelation from inside faith, and in particular the notion of change in the way you understand narrative. And I'm not saying narrative is the only way that revelation occurs, only that it's one of the ways in which revelation occurs but can also change. And the art is not essential to the presentation, but since some of you may not know the references I make, we're going to provide them. So, to begin the paper, the old model of revelation assumed that what was received was also what God had said, something very close to the divine intention. Now, however, in the light of biblical criticism, we need to acknowledge that continuing with any model of revelation at all requires us to say that what was heard remained partial and imperfect, something on the way to a complete disclosure rather than such a totality in itself. In other words, revelation is something more indirect, discovered in response to and interchange with texts that may themselves change their input as new circumstances make their possible meaning clearer. Sometimes the aim will be the maintenance of the original in its full power, something's necessary to change, and sometimes the completion will involve turning what was seen retrospectively as imperfect to something better. For some, that description may seem an impossible scenario. How could God allow a less than perfect, less than complete version of his purposes to emerge in a way that requires subsequent modification and clarification? The answer surely is that God values something more, that human beings should respond to the divine communication at their speed rather than God's, such that it genuinely becomes part of who they are rather than simply imposed from without. Alternatively, consider the matter from a sociological perspective. All human thought is conditioned, that is, contextualized by antecedent beliefs. If so, movement towards change tends to be gradual, but with some building upon earlier patterns of explanation. While such altered perspectives are not always mediated through changes in the way in which particular narratives are told, because that's the theme of our conference, I want to focus here on a number of such examples from both Testaments. In the case of the Hebrew Scriptures, I shall take the story of creation and the sacrifice of Isaac. With the New Testament, I want to consider the Annunciation, the wise men, and various parables. Throughout, I shall be concerned to emphasize the key role the imagination plays in such retellings. Discovering divine truth is a matter of wrestling with narratives and their applicability to the believer's thoughts and action in the way that allows new versions of the narrative to emerge as fresh challenges are faced. So it's from living within a tradition that change occurs. Sometimes this involves detecting a better fit to reality, sometimes a better fit to present context, and sometimes it involves actually changing the text, whereas other times it involves filling what I call the interstices or gaps in that text. Usually some trigger is present in the present situation, alerts the believer to the need for change, but to be seen as plausible, it must also present itself as a plausible trajectory from the original version of the narrative. I shall allow listeners to see how this works out in practice with specific examples before repeating these general points once more at the end of this essay. So, example 1, the creation narratives. Modern scholarship tells us that there are two creation stories in Genesis, and that's how the Bible opens. Most biblical scholars will say that there was an original, rather naive narrative written by the Yahwist, or J, perhaps in the 9th century BC, who is replaced by a later editor, the priestly P, perhaps in the 3rd century BC. But the clumsiness of P enabled these clever biblical scholars to see that the two narratives had been combined, and so successfully identify what belonged to each. So Genesis 1 to chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 4 is attributed to the priestly source, and 2:4 to 3:24 to J, the earlier text. But this idea of a failed replacement as the aim, is that not somewhat unfair? Could P not have been concerned to improve J, but even at the same time as he recognized value in the earlier narrative? So P is not concerned to deny the value of that earlier narrative, but to develop upon it. And so that's why that earlier narrative is also preserved in what turns out to be an inconsistent way. What presumably worried P was J's unqualified anthropomorphism, God walks in the garden and that kind of thing, and his failure to have any vision beyond the earth. It's very much earth-focused. And P changes that by introducing a creation of all the universe. Why did that happen? It could partly have been prompted by the larger vision of some of the major prophets, particularly 2nd Isaiah, and it could partly have been prompted by rival Middle Eastern myths. So, for example, Babylonian Enuma Elish myth gives you an account of the whole creation in a way that P now does. Indeed, that's what some biblical scholars have suggested, the influence of the Babylonian myth in the first verse, because Teom, or the deep in Hebrew, appears in the opening verse as a demythologized version of the destroyed goddess Tiamat, mentioned in the corresponding biblical Babylonian epic. But even so, that wasn't yet the complete story. So we then get a further development because there's no doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. Instead, P offers us an account of the beauty and the goodness of the world's design. And God saw that it was good, it is repeated each time. But he appears to assume, like P, that this came not out of nothing, but rather from some formless version of matter. So Genesis 1:2, the earth was a formless deep, and darkness covered the face of the deep. The fuller account of the creation's origins had to wait until arguments about the resurrection of the dead turned on the question of God being seen as once more creating de novo. So it was in the period of the Maccabees that we first get a doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, and the argument goes, if God created everything, couldn't he also recreate in the afterlife? So that's in the 2nd century BC, and that would seem as a plausible force towards moving to a change yet again in how the community understands this particular narrative within which it lives. And so we find the book of Jubilees, perhaps written in the 1st century BC, echoing the vocabulary of Genesis, but now telling us that the abysses and the darkness are created on the first day. So in other words, everything is now created by God. That particular book is regarded as canonical in the Ethiopian church, but interestingly, it's also at Qumran. And so clearly the community at Qumran thought that both Genesis and Qumran and Jubilees and Genesis were telling us something about our placing in this narrative of creation. And that's particularly interesting because, of course, Qumran is a very rigorous community, and yet it's giving status to the two versions as telling us something about God. So it wants creatio ex nihilo from the book of Jubilees, but it wants also everything that's said in Genesis. But another reason that it likes Jubilees, apart from the possibility it may have been written there, is that it tells us that angels were created on the first day of creation. And that is particularly good from Qumran's point of view, because it means that the fallible Jewish temple in Jerusalem is not an absolute necessity for divine worship. There's always been perfect divine worship in heaven. So that story I've been trying to suggest is of a community living within a particular account of how it conceives its placing in creation, but developing as it listens to its setting in particular contexts. But the story doesn't end there, for it's too easy for Christians to suppose that the serpent in the garden had always been taken as a reference to Satan. But in fact, Satan was not a major figure in the biblical text at all, and the earliest references to Satan as a major figure are in Wisdom and 1 Enoch. The book of Job's picturing of Satan, he's still an angel on God's side, rather, given an adversarial position. So it's the new way that Judaism is moving to making him a major figure that encourages Paul to take that position in Romans 16, but also encourages him to a general view of there being a cosmic battle going on that now is part of the text. And so his notion of the fall of Adam as definitive for theology. Augustine then develops that further in his doctrine of original sin on the basis of Paul's Romans 5:12. That's to say, as an inherited fault passed on to subsequent generations. But note what's happening here now is that we've got two different forms of the text, because we've now got the Christian one putting the story in interstices of a major conflict with Satan and the fall that Judaism doesn't accept, and it keeps the earlier story that every individual has the capacity to respond to the divine initiative. And it's only in the 19th century that we again get that option taken up within Christianity, for example, in Hegel. So the point of this first quick survey has been to observe how biblical narratives do not necessarily remain static, but are subject to imaginative reinterpretation, sometimes through writing, as in P and Jubilees, and sometimes through the same material being read in a new way, as in Paul and Augustine. In the process, it is not that the past was discarded, rather some trigger provides an occasion for further reflection that helps produce a better fit to both natural assumptions about the world and religion's overall fit and account of it. Second example, the sacrifice of Isaac. For a different example, consider Genesis 22 and the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. Perhaps largely under the influence of Kierkegaard's interpretation of the story in his essay Fear and Trembling, contemporary exegesis makes the dilemma faced by Abraham the central focus of the story, and today's theologians have largely adopted that same stance. But the history of reception tells us a quite different tale in all three monotheistic religions. For Judaism, the Akedah, or binding, is primarily about the self-sacrifice of Isaac. For patristic Christianity, it is of Jesus as a type. Is of Isaac as a type of Jesus' own future sacrifice. While for Islam, it becomes the model act of the true Muslim, Ishmael as precursor of the Arabic peoples. In trying to comprehend the difference, a number of factors may be noted. The first is that the author does not provide any extenuating reason for the demand. So you were simply not told why. God doesn't tell Abraham why he should do it. The second lies in the apparent cruelty of the art, forcibly presented in many a painting. So we've got Caravaggio's Sacrifice of Isaac, and you can see that Caravaggio certainly thought it was an extremely cruel act. But even Rembrandt finds difficulty. So Simon Sharma describes it there as Abraham even finding himself forced to put his hand over the head of his son, forcibly holding him down. But then another factor is, just to give a final example of these problems, here's a modern biblical commentator on the act, James Crenshaw. No acquisition of fresh insight seems sufficiently precious to justify the private hell initiated by these words, take your son and offer him as a burnt offering. So there's two reasons, no explanation given, the apparent cruelty of the act, and the final one is a different notion of responsibility in play. So the more corporatist approach to ethics in earlier Judaism has been replaced by a more individual one. So if you think of the Decalogue, we're told that God visits the sins of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. And that contrasts with Ezekiel that says, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. So the community living in the face of these difficulties tries to answer them. One way is to give a reason, God giving a reason. So if we look at the letter of Hebrews in chapter 11, the author there tells us that Abraham knew that God could raise his son from the dead. But historically that's impossible, either in terms of when the act is supposed to take place or when the text was written, because in neither case was resurrection of the dead there. Others resolve the horror by augmenting the narrative. On the Muslim version, it becomes the older son, Ishmael, who must therefore have been fully aware of what was being required. Similarly, on the patristic approach, it is a cooperative adventure. So at the end of the first century, Clement of Rome observes, Isaac knew with confidence what was about to happen. It was with gladness that he was led forth as the sacrificial victim. And similarly, Rembrandt changes his mind in his later, I haven't got the illustration here, but he changed his mind later under Jewish influence from his friends in Amsterdam and shows Isaac and Abraham considering the act together. But most important of all would seem to me the nature of the sacrifice was transformed. Self-sacrifice was now seen as a much nobler ideal than the sacrifice of another, even were it to involve one's favourite child. However, note that unlike with the narrative of creation, in this case there is no new version of the words of the narrative. Rather, if I may put it like this, is rather that gaps or interstices are filled out. So exactly the same words are actually now heard, but in a rather different way. An extreme example may be used to underline the point. The author of the Midrash Genesis, Rabbah, that 4th or 5th century AD, is insistent that nothing new should be added, but instead he suggests that the narrative of the incident should stop at a different place, in the first two verses of Genesis 23, with its account of the death of Sarah. His argument is that Sarah must have died as a result of shock at what happened. So given that she gave birth to Isaac at age 90 and she is now 127, Isaac must actually have been 37 years old at the time the incident happened. So now you've got the fully responsible Isaac really making the decision for sacrifice. Now, my point in rehearsing this history is not to suggest that the earlier version was rightly supplanted by the later, but rather that revelation, God's address to humanity, lies in the totality of that history, and not just at its end, as the church once assumed, when everyone would have said Isaac is representing Christ and so must be an adult, nor in the modern way, which says go back to Abraham's dilemma, as with Kierkegaard. There's an openness to the narrative that means that it's only right and proper that both types of approach need to be considered by the community. So that's my two examples from the Hebrew Bible. Now to the New Testament. Take first the Annunciation. The narrative has inspired countless paintings and poems. Sadly, in such contexts, these are usually described as simply illustrative, as though they add nothing really significant, with still only one narrative remaining definitive, that in Luke. But such a description ignores what is perhaps the most important feature of the evangelist narrative, its very brevity and incompleteness, with so much left untold. For example, who bends the knee to whom? What was Mary doing at the time? How was she dressed? And so on. It would be wrong to suggest that artists should have left such questions unanswered. Simply to put brush to paint required numerous such additions if they were to be a painted canvas at all, and so with them a fuller narrative that more effectively engages the imagination. And so preachers equally would do this kind of thing in trying to imagine the details. And so the result was, of course, slightly different versions of Luke's narrative, with the interstices of his text now filled, as it were. The result was viewers better able to engage with the story, precisely because reflection was now encouraged along one particular track rather than another. Take the issue, for example, of what she was doing at the time. Orthodox icons have retained traditional imagery of Mary either spinning or else gathering water at a well. Whereas in the medieval West, the practice of depicting her reading the prophecy of Isaiah that foretells the Annunciation or praying eventually became firmly established. The result was that whereas Eastern practice suggested her engagement with the ordinary feminine tasks of the day, and that was one of her key roles in identifying with us, Western developments offered a more reflective Mary. So her identification with us involved her praying, her reading, and so on, even if this was at the cost of assuming a literacy that's historically unlikely, given the society of the time. However, it's not those developments I want to pursue here. Instead, as just one of the many choices an artist would need to make, consider the impact of the Virgin kneeling before the angel in deference or wonder or awe, or against the other option, that it is the angel who kneels before Mary. I've got that the wrong way around, sorry. Yes. So either the Virgin kneeling before the angel, deference, wonder, and fear, or the angel kneeling before Mary in awe of her, not just as the future God-bearer, but also as, in some sense, already blessed. The issue arises in large part because of the words used in the angel's address. In the Vulgate, Jerome chose to translate the Greek with the Latin gratia plena, full of grace, which was given as the opening words of the Angelus, Hail Mary, full of grace. A phrase that's most naturally taken to imply that she was chosen because she was already imbued with grace, already holy. Unfortunately, if so, such an account conflicts with the most common modern interpretation of what the original Greek meant, and that this is something still to happen. Greetings, favoured one. The result has been two quite different presentations, with more recent art on the whole preferring a more reticent, not to say frightened Mary. But you can see the dilemma even in the Renaissance. So if we look at Leonardo's version here, the Virgin is entirely confident in what is happening, and she's even pointing to Isaiah's text to remind the angel that that's what's supposed to be happening. But by contrast, Botticelli, who's contemporary, this is the Uffizi version. You can interpret this in a number of ways, but she's clearly deferential or somewhat in awe of what's happening. And this is still more evident in the Glasgow version here, again Botticelli. But as biblical scholarship becomes more widely known, so does the iconography change. So this is now 19th century England, and this is Dante Gabriel Rossetti, where clearly Mary is cowering at the prospect of her future role. And going to another 19th century Black American artist, Henry Ossabattana, you can see she's very perplexed. And also the image of the angel has become more ambiguous. Now, a narrow historical approach might suggest that only one of these two options can be true. And so if modern scholarship is correct, images such as Leonardo's must therefore be pronounced as without value. But there's an alternative, and that is to say that we are in effect offered two different but complementary versions of the narrative. One from Mary's perspective at the time, something like this one, and the other from the divine standpoint, her eventual elevated status. The point would therefore be that everything depends on the question to which fit one addresses the question of the narrative's appropriation. Are you doing it at the bar of historical verisimilitude or at overall theological judgment? So they both could actually be true if you raise different questions about them. Imaginatively, for the practice of faith, we need both perspectives. We need both to identify with Mary in her initial position, but also as she is now with our Lord in heaven. And I can't see why we can't therefore say that both stories can be lived into. So my next example, shepherds and wise men. Turning now to the traditions of the Nativity, there are of course a cluster of reasons why the Christmas season attracts more worshippers to church than either Good Friday or Easter Sunday. Among them is undoubtedly the inclusion of poor shepherds along with rich kings, Balthasar, Caspar and Melchior, often portrayed by children, whether in the service itself or in accompanying nativity plays. Indeed, so deeply embodied is this aspect that few in church would recognize the pageant as really a post-biblical retelling of the story. And I suspect most theologians don't recognize this either. But anyway, yet almost certainly, Luke's reason for referring to shepherds has nothing to do with their poverty and everything to do with his concern to stress Jesus' Davidic ancestry as a shepherd king. And David is actually mentioned 6 times to make the point in the first 2 chapters. Equally, Matthew's visitors are not kings, it doesn't say anywhere that in the narrative, but magoi or astrologers. And they're placed there by Matthew to balance his use of Old Testament prophecy. So just as Jews longed for a savior, and that's shown by all the prophecies he quotes, So Gentiles did this longing in their pagan equivalent, namely astrology. And that's proving the point. So he manages to open his gospel by showing Gentiles longing for a saviour, and he manages to end his gospel by Mark 28:19, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, again addressing the Gentiles. And that's very important for Matthew because throughout his gospel, Jesus is shown as not addressing his message to Gentiles. So Matthew's version, Matthew 10:6, go nowhere among the Gentiles, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So that's the story of the earthly life, bracketed by a message to the Gentiles. Now, even some reception historians, even Ulrich Lutz, who's supposed to have founded the discipline of reception criticism, have contended it would be good to get back to this biblical original. But are they right? Well, Matthew's message is still pertinent in the Holy Land today about relations Jews and Gentiles, and it was also highly encouraging in the early mission of the church, where Jews and pagans shared in the common worship of their new Lord. As Europe became progressively Christian and connections with Jerusalem more tenuous, it was not unnatural that a new form of the story would be sought. At one level, this emerged simply out of the fact that various passages in the Old Testament offered that alternative possibility, such as Psalm 72 and Isaiah 60. But such prophecies can scarcely be the whole explanation, since Matthew actually ignored them despite his general use of such scriptures. So I think while they may have given an occasion to start thinking in this way, the real trigger was elsewhere. And one was, and it's all to do with a better fit to context. In the first place, it's a response to various tensions in medieval society between, for example, rich and poor shepherds, rich kings, young and old, so you have every age represented among the kings, women and men, so the shepherds bring their wives, and so you've that kind of mixture, and the wives have sometimes to control the husbands and so on. But secondly, and more importantly, there is the way in which the new version of the narrative allowed an address to every Christian, whatever their status. So the kings represent the three known continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, three different ages, the shepherds, the poor. Not that this was in any sense a purely intellectual appeal to inclusiveness. It was an effective power of the retelling that ensured its embedding in the Christian tradition. And you can see that in numerous paintings, which I haven't brought along with me, and also in poetry, and that continues into the 20th century. Just to mention one example, the Carol of the Brown King by the Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes. Speaking of Balthazar, the carol ends, 3 wise men, one dark like me, part of his nativity. So the black are included. That's the bond. Now, some may object that endorsing that change, I've wrongly abandoned questions of historicity, to which I would reply that history is not the key point here anyway. But even so, the poverty of the shepherds can still be seen as an imaginative trajectory from Luke's account, even if that's not the primary reason that led Luke to place them there. For shepherds in the ancient world were generally poor, even if Luke was using them differently. Similarly, the symbolic gifts of the astrologists, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, do imply wealth, even if it doesn't imply kings. So to my final example then in Jesus' parables. Just a brief discussion of approach to Jesus' parables. Is Adolf Jülicher theories are right that only one point was ever intended by some particular parable, then it looks as though there is already in the Gospels some rewriting by the evangelists and not just by the later church, for example, in the tenants in the vineyard. A scholar like Tony Thistleton, who wrote on both textual issues and on doctrine, used frequently to declare that the only important version of the parable was what was in the original, what came directly from Jesus. But why should later retellings necessarily be any the less illuminating and not perhaps sometimes more effective in the better fit the parable now has to some new context? And take, for instance, then, the parable of the prodigal son. While many scholars think the story was created as a single piece, and indeed there are a few, like the Jewish scholar Emil Gil Levine, who would make the key element the reference to the elder brother, it is more commonly suggested that this part was added later, even perhaps by Jesus himself, to deal with disputes among his disciples. Indeed, that's how the aspect is rather movingly used in Zeffirelli's film Jesus of Nazareth, whereas it's told as a means of dealing with Peter's objection to the calling of Matthew the tax gatherer. So even Jesus may have been using this open narrative technique to rewrite a parable. But again, we can ask the point of how artists use it. Almost all Protestants will know this one, very moving Rembrandt portrayal of the story, and used as a great theme of indicating divine grace. But it will not be so clean on that one, which is Puvis de Chavannes' 19th century one. And those of you who are Catholics will realize it's a reference to sacramental confession and hitting your breast during confession to indicate your penance. But that reference to penance is actually also in the parable. At 1518. So why can't they both be versions of how the parable might be appropriated? Sometimes it is through sacramental confession that someone's brought back to God. Sometimes it's in another way, the more Rembrandt kind of way. And then as a final example of these kinds of changes, think of the choreographer Georges Balanchine's introduction into Prokofiev's ballet of the same name, A Role for Women. So both the mother and the daughters intercede on the prodigal's behalf. As a devout Orthodox Christian, Balanchine saw the original version as altogether too individualistic, effectively not taking seriously enough the interdependent character of the society of the church. So is that writing inappropriate, rewriting inappropriate, or is it rather filling out the parable? Living within a particular tradition doesn't mean that there's a divinative text that can't be changed. Equally, if we take another parable, the Good Samaritan, what do we say of Augustine's version, which turns it into Christ as the Good Samaritan and us as the wounded traveller? This seems very effective, but it's certainly not what the parable originally meant. Yet in terms of details, certainly Augustine then gets into trouble because he tries to produce an allegory. So the moon becomes a move towards death, and the innkeeper becomes the Apostle Paul, and that just seems a bit odd. So I'm not suggesting everything goes about change. I'm trying to say there's a discrimination that goes on that things can be revelatory as they change. But let me now hasten to my conclusion. Just outlining again the main assumptions behind my examples. Most important of all is the view that revelations through narrative should not be seen as a single event, but a history of open narratives that change as new issues arise. In saying this, I do not wish to challenge the view that the canon of Scripture is definitive, but I would deny this means that it is exclusive, for sometimes important changes have occurred subsequent to its closure. Instead, we need to think of triggers or occasions for change occurring in developments both within Scripture and beyond. And it's by trying imaginatively to inhabit the existing canon of assumptions, as it were, that later contributors have been led to modify the story in important ways, sometimes by changing the text, and sometimes by viewing it through a different lens. And of course, I'd want to apply my examples to much larger cases, but I'm trying you out with smaller examples at the moment. This is emphatically not to suggest that anything goes. Instead, there is need for some sense of plausible trajectory from what has gone before, as measured against either a more accurate fit to the religion's overall sense of reality, or else in fit to the specific context to which the narrative is now addressed. So, for example, P and Jubilees both offered a better fit to reality than J, now that the metaphysical horizons of the community had expanded, while Kings and Shepherd offered a better contrast in the present context of medieval Europe than had the earlier version in Matthew and Luke. It may be objected that adopting such approach makes revelatory truth a matter of degree. How good a fit to reality is it? How good a fit to present context? I entirely agree. What I'm offering is a matter of degree. But then many people writing in other areas are now moving in that direction, including philosophers of science. So one book I much like is Catherine Elgin's True Enough, which suggests even in science, truth is relative to context. Thank you.